August 19, 1942, 10:47 a.m., Cairo, Egypt. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery stepped out of his staff car into the blazing desert heat, his pale blue eyes scanning the British 8th Army headquarters compound. The thermometer read 47 degrees Celsius in the shade, but there was precious little shade to be found. Montgomery had arrived just 18 hours earlier to take command of what many considered a broken army, an army that had been pushed back across hundreds of miles of North African desert by Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. As he walked toward the command tent, his aide handed him a decoded message from London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill wanted an immediate assessment and timeline for offensive operations. The message was clear in its urgency and Churchill's growing impatience with defeats in the desert. Montgomery folded the telegram and slipped it into his breast pocket. In 6 hours, he would send a reply that would either make his career or end it. He was about to promise Winston Churchill something that every military expert said was impossible: a complete victory over Rommel in exactly 90 days. The situation Montgomery inherited was catastrophic by any reasonable measure. The 8th Army had been retreating for months, losing ground, equipment, and morale with each engagement. Rommel's Afrika Korps had pushed British forces back from Libya into Egypt, coming within 60 miles of Alexandria and the vital Suez Canal. British casualties since January 1942 numbered over 80, the UOL-Zara's men killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering: 400 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 900 artillery pieces lost, 15 EU-Saturn vehicles of all types written off as total losses. The psychological impact was even worse. British forces in North Africa had developed what military psychologists would later term Rommel syndrome, an almost superstitious fear of the German general's tactical brilliance. Men who had fought bravely in other theaters would freeze when facing the distinctive profile of German Mark IV tanks emerging from desert mirages. Intelligence reports painted an equally grim picture. Rommel commanded approximately 100 Zara'n men, divided between his German Afrika Korps and Italian divisions. His tank strength included 440 operational panzers, many of them the new Mark IV specials with long 75mm guns that could penetrate British armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. German logistics, despite the length of their supply lines, remained robust. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment continued flowing through Tripoli and Benghazi. Most concerning of all, Rommel's forces were positioned just 90 minutes' drive from Alexandria, where panic was already spreading among British civilian administrators and Egyptian government officials. Montgomery spent his first day conducting what he called a reality assessment. Unlike his predecessors, who had remained at headquarters poring over maps and intelligence summaries, Montgomery drove directly to forward positions. He visited artillery batteries dug in among the rocks and scrub brush, their crews blackened by cordite and exhausted from weeks of defensive fighting. He walked through field hospitals where doctors worked by lamplight, operating on British and German wounded side by side. The smell of antiseptic, blood, and desert dust created an atmosphere that would stay with him for decades. At tank repair depots, he watched mechanics cannibalizing destroyed Valentines and Matildas for spare parts, their oil-stained hands working with desperate efficiency to keep even a few machines operational. What Montgomery saw convinced him that previous commanders had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of desert warfare. They had tried to fight Rommel using European tactics adapted for sand and heat, but Rommel had created entirely new doctrines based on speed, concentration, and psychological warfare. British forces were responding to German innovations rather than creating their own advantages. This reactive posture had to change completely. That evening, Montgomery assembled his staff officers in the main briefing tent. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red pins showing German positions and blue pins indicating British defensive lines. The disparity was immediately obvious. German pins formed aggressive arrow-shaped formations pointing toward the Nile Delta, while British pins clustered in defensive circles around vital points. Montgomery studied these displays for several minutes before speaking. His voice carried the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. He began with a statement that shocked everyone present. The Eighth Army would not merely hold its current positions or conduct a limited withdrawal. Within 90 days, they would launch a massive offensive that would destroy Rommel's Afrika Korps as an effective fighting force and drive German forces completely out of Egypt. Several senior officers exchanged glances of barely concealed disbelief. Colonel Francis de Guingond, Montgomery's chief of staff, later wrote that the silence following this announcement lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in military briefings where immediate acknowledgement was expected. Montgomery understood their skepticism because he had spent hours analyzing the mathematical realities of his promise. British forces currently numbered approximately 195,000 men, but nearly 60,000 were support personnel, engineers, medical staff, and logistics specialists. Actual combat strength totaled roughly 135,000 troops, many of whom were recent replacements with minimal desert experience. Tank strength stood at just 164 operational machines, most of them obsolescent designs that German guns could penetrate at maximum range while remaining invulnerable to British return fire. Artillery batteries possessed adequate numbers, but lacked the sophisticated fire control systems that made German guns so devastatingly accurate. Air support was limited to 340 operational aircraft, split between fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes. These numbers suggested defensive operations only, yet Montgomery was proposing the largest British offensive in North Africa since the war began. The gap between resources and ambition seemed insurmountable. The key to Montgomery's confidence lay in intelligence information that even most senior British commanders did not possess. Ultra-intercepts, Britain's most closely guarded secret, were providing detailed information about German logistics, unit strengths, and strategic planning. These decoded messages revealed critical vulnerabilities in Rommel's seemingly invincible position. German fuel supplies were more precarious than anyone realized, with reserves sufficient for only 12 days of intensive operations. Tank maintenance was becoming increasingly problematic, as spare parts shipments faced constant interdiction by British naval forces and RAF bombing. Most importantly, Rommel himself was ill, suffering from liver problems and exhaustion that were affecting his judgment and stamina. These intelligence advantages gave Montgomery insights that no previous British commander had possessed, but they also created enormous pressure to act decisively before German logistics improved or Rommel recovered his health. Montgomery's strategy represented a complete reversal of previous British tactics. Instead of responding to German initiatives, he would force Rommel to react to British movements. Instead of fighting defensive battles at times and places of German choosing, he would create situations where German forces had to attack prepared British positions or surrender strategic initiative. Most radically, he would abandon the mobility-focused approach that previous commanders had attempted in favor of concentrated firepower and methodical advance. This decision flew in the face of conventional wisdom about desert warfare, which emphasized speed and maneuver over frontal assault. Montgomery believed that British advantages in artillery, air support, and logistics could overcome German tactical superiority if properly concentrated and applied systematically. The first phase of Montgomery's plan involved psychological warfare, on a scale never before attempted in the Desert Campaign. He ordered immediate changes to uniforms, equipment marking, and unit insignia, designed to signal renewed confidence and aggressive intent. Tank crews were instructed to paint kill marks on their gun barrels, even if those kills had been achieved by previous crews or different tanks. Artillery units began firing harassment barrages every night, not to achieve tactical objectives, but to demonstrate that British forces were no longer merely defending. RAF squadrons received orders to conduct daily reconnaissance flights over German positions, deliberately allowing themselves to be detected to signal constant British surveillance. These psychological operations were designed to convince German forces that they faced a transformed enemy with renewed capabilities and determination. If you want to discover how Montgomery turned mathematical impossibility into strategic reality through a combination of deception, logistics, and pure audacity, please leave a like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories of military brilliance, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, to not miss future episodes where we uncover the hidden details that changed history. Simultaneously, Montgomery implemented the most comprehensive logistical buildup in British military history. Supply convoys began arriving daily from India, Australia, and the United States, carrying not just replacement equipment, but entirely new weapon systems. American Sherman tanks, with their powerful 75mm guns and thick frontal armor, started flowing through Port Said at a rate of 40 per week. These machines were qualitatively superior to anything in German or British inventories, capable of engaging German panzers on equal terms for the first time in the North African campaign. Artillery reinforcements included new 25-pounder guns with improved ammunition and fire control systems that could deliver accurate counter-battery fire against German positions. Air reinforcements were equally dramatic, with Spitfire squadrons arriving from Britain and new American P-40 Warhawks coming through Lend-Lease channels. By early October, British air strength had increased to over 750 operational aircraft, achieving local air superiority for the first time since Rommel's arrival in North Africa. Training programs instituted by Montgomery were revolutionary in their comprehensiveness and intensity. Every unit in the 8th Army, from infantry companies to tank squadrons to artillery batteries, participated in combined arms exercises designed to create seamless coordination between different combat elements. These exercises took place in conditions identical to anticipated battle scenarios, with live ammunition, real explosions, and communication systems operating under combat stress. Infantry soldiers learned to advance behind creeping artillery barrages, maintaining precise distances and timing that would keep them safe while maximizing pressure on enemy positions. Tank crews practiced breakthrough techniques, learning to concentrate firepower against specific points in German defensive lines, rather than spreading their attacks across wide fronts. Artillery observers trained with forward infantry units, developing the split-second timing necessary for close support fires that could strike German positions without endangering British troops. Montgomery's personal involvement in these preparations was unprecedented for a commander of his rank. He visited training exercises daily, often arriving unannounced to observe realistic conditions without staged demonstrations. He insisted on eating the same field rations as common soldiers, sleeping in identical tents, and using the same basic equipment that would be available during combat operations. This visible leadership style had immediate effects on morale and unit cohesion. Soldiers who had been demoralized by months of retreat began expressing confidence in their new commander and his methods. Desertion rates, which had reached alarming levels during the summer retreat, dropped to near zero. Medical reports indicated significant improvements in stress-related illnesses and combat fatigue among frontline units. The transformation in fighting spirit was measurable and dramatic. Perhaps most importantly, Montgomery established direct communication channels with Winston Churchill that bypassed normal command structures and allowed for real-time strategic coordination. These conversations, conducted through secure telegraph lines, gave Churchill unprecedented visibility into operational planning, while giving Montgomery immediate access to strategic resources and political support. Churchill, desperately needing good news from any theater of operations, was personally invested in Montgomery's success to a degree that created both opportunities and enormous pressure. The Prime Minister made clear that failure in Egypt could result in the fall of his government and potentially Britain's exit from the Mediterranean theater entirely. This political dimension added weight to Montgomery's 90-day promise, transforming it from military boast to national commitment. Do you have a grandfather, father, or uncle who served and never talked about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment now saying simply, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family, you're preserving memory for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. German intelligence services were reporting these British preparations to Rommel, but their assessments consistently underestimated the scale and sophistication of Montgomery's buildup. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights confirmed increased British activity, but failed to distinguish between routine supply operations and the systematic accumulation of offensive capabilities. German communications intercepts detected increased radio traffic, but could not penetrate the new encryption systems being used by British units. Most critically, Rommel's own illness was affecting his ability to process intelligence information and develop appropriate countermeasures. The German commander who had demonstrated such tactical brilliance throughout 1941 and early 1942 was operating at diminished capacity precisely when maximum alertness was required. On October 23, 1942, at exactly 9:40 p.m., Montgomery's offensive began with the largest artillery barrage in North African history. Over 900 British guns opened fire simultaneously along a 20-mile front, delivering more than 15 Ausübungsauern shells in the first hour alone. The sound was audible 60 miles away in Alexandria, where British civilians gathered on rooftops to watch the horizon flash with continuous explosions. German defensive positions, carefully prepared over months of construction, began disintegrating under the precision and intensity of British firepower. Communications lines were severed, command bunkers collapsed, and ammunition dumps erupted in secondary explosions that added to the destruction. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to tactical superiority found themselves subjected to firepower concentrations they had never experienced. Many units lost cohesion within the first 30 minutes of the barrage. Infantry assault began at 10:00 p.m. under cover of darkness and continuing artillery support. British battalions, trained extensively in night fighting techniques, advanced in carefully coordinated waves designed to maintain pressure, while minimizing casualties from German defensive fire. Each assault group carried detailed maps showing exact locations of German strongpoints, wire obstacles, and minefield boundaries. This intelligence, derived from months of reconnaissance and aerial photography, allowed British forces to avoid many of the defensive preparations that might have slowed their advance. Engineers accompanied each assault wave, clearing mines and wire obstacles with an efficiency that surprised even British commanders. The systematic destruction of German defensive positions proceeded ahead of schedule, with objectives that Montgomery had allocated 6 hours to capture, falling within 90 minutes. Tank warfare during the offensive demonstrated the superiority of Montgomery's new equipment and tactics. Sherman tanks, operating in coordinated squadrons, systematically engaged German panzers at ranges where British guns were effective, while German return fire proved inadequate. The qualitative advantage was dramatic and immediately apparent. German Mark IV tanks, which had dominated previous engagements, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by machines they had no effective answer to. British tank crews, trained extensively in new tactics, concentrated firepower against specific targets, rather than engaging in the individual duels that had previously favored German experience and equipment. Within 48 hours, German tank strength had been reduced by more than 60%, with most surviving machines forced to withdraw beyond artillery range to avoid complete destruction. Air operations proceeded with equal success as British and American aircraft achieved complete aerial supremacy over the battlefield. German aircraft, operating from distant airfields with limited fuel supplies, could maintain only token resistance against the concentrated Allied air presence. British fighters shot down German reconnaissance planes before they could report on ground operations, while Allied bombers systematically destroyed German supply lines, ammunition depots, and communication centers. The interdiction campaign was so successful that German forces began experiencing ammunition shortages within 72 hours of the offensive's beginning. Artillery units were rationed to fewer than 10 rounds per day per gun, while tank crews were ordered to engage only targets of immediate tactical importance. Rommel, returning from medical treatment in Germany, arrived at his headquarters on October 25th to find his Africa Corps in full retreat and his defensive lines completely shattered. The speed and completeness of the British breakthrough had exceeded even Montgomery's most optimistic projections. German formations that had maintained cohesion through months of successful operations were disintegrating under pressure they could not counter or escape. Rommel attempted to organize counterattacks using his remaining mobile reserves, but these efforts were quickly detected by British intelligence and disrupted by precise artillery concentrations before they could develop into serious threats. The tactical flexibility that had made Rommel legendary became useless when his forces lacked the fuel, ammunition, and communications necessary for complex maneuvers. By November 4, 1942, exactly 12 days after the offensive began, German forces were in full retreat toward Libya, with British armored columns in close pursuit. The Afrika Korps, which had seemed invincible just weeks earlier, had lost more than half its combat strength and virtually all of its heavy equipment. Tank losses exceeded 450 machines destroyed or abandoned, while artillery losses included nearly every heavy gun in German inventory. Personnel casualties were equally severe, with over 30,000 German and Italian soldiers killed, wounded, or captured during the 12-day battle. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, German logistical capabilities in North Africa had been completely shattered. Fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, and maintenance facilities stretching back hundreds of miles had been overrun or destroyed by British forces advancing faster than anyone had thought possible. Churchill's reaction to news of the victory was immediate and emotional. According to witnesses present in the cabinet war rooms, the Prime Minister broke down in tears upon receiving Montgomery's telegram confirming the complete destruction of Rommel's defensive positions. This was the first major British land victory against German forces since the war began, ending a string of defeats that had lasted nearly 3 years. The psychological impact in Britain was enormous, with civilian morale improving dramatically and public confidence in ultimate victory returning for the first time since France fell in 1940. Church bells rang throughout Britain for the first time since 1940, marking what Churchill called the end of the beginning of Britain's fight against Nazi Germany. The international implications were equally significant. American officials who had harbored doubts about British fighting capabilities gained new confidence in their European allies. Soviet leadership, desperate for any indication that Britain would maintain an active Western front, received reassurance that British forces could conduct successful offensive operations. Most importantly, neutral nations began shifting toward the Allied side as evidence mounted that German forces were not invincible and that the outcome of the war remained undecided. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical success in determining the battle's long-term strategic significance. Montgomery's promise had been fulfilled with 8 days to spare. The 90-day timeline he had given Churchill proved unnecessarily conservative, with complete victory achieved in just 82 days from his assumption of command. The mathematical impossibility of defeating Rommel with available British resources had been overcome through superior logistics, better intelligence, improved training, and above all, systematic application of concentrated firepower rather than attempts to match German tactical mobility. The victory validated entirely new approaches to desert warfare and established principles that would guide Allied operations throughout the remainder of the North African campaign. Montgomery's post-war reflections on the campaign emphasized the importance of realistic assessment combined with bold action. He had recognized that British forces possessed significant advantages in logistics, intelligence, and strategic position, but these advantages required systematic exploitation rather than tactical brilliance. By promising Churchill a specific timeline for victory, he had created psychological pressure that forced comprehensive preparation and prevented the gradual, cautious approach that had characterized previous British operations. The 90-day deadline had served as much as a planning tool as a public commitment, ensuring that all preparation activities maintained urgency and focus throughout the build-up period. The personal cost of the victory for Montgomery was considerable, but largely invisible to public observation. The stress of commanding during preparations and combat had aged him visibly, with medical examinations showing elevated blood pressure and chronic insomnia that would persist for years. The responsibility of carrying British hopes for victory in a major land campaign had created psychological pressure, unlike anything he had previously experienced. Several close associates noted personality changes that became permanent, including increased attention to detail and decreased tolerance for subordinate initiative. The success had established his reputation, but also created expectations for continued brilliance that would influence his leadership style throughout the remainder of his career. Rommel's assessment of his defeat was characteristically honest and tactically sophisticated. In reports to German High Command, he acknowledged that British forces had achieved qualitative and quantitative superiority that made successful defense impossible under existing circumstances. More significantly, he recognized that Montgomery's approach represented entirely new thinking about desert warfare that German doctrine had not anticipated or prepared to counter. The systematic application of overwhelming firepower, combined with meticulous logistical preparation, had neutralized the tactical advantages that German forces had exploited so successfully during previous campaigns. Rommel recommended fundamental changes to German strategy in North Africa, but by November 1942, the broader strategic situation made such changes impossible to implement. British forces continued their pursuit of retreating German units throughout November and December, maintaining pressure that prevented any organized defensive stand until Rommel reached prepared positions in Tunisia. The psychological momentum generated by the initial victory proved as valuable as the tactical success in determining subsequent operations. German morale, previously sustained by confidence in superior leadership and equipment, never fully recovered from the shock of complete defeat at the hands of forces they had been defeating consistently for over a year. British confidence, conversely, was permanently transformed by evidence that German forces could be not merely defeated, but completely routed when faced with proper preparation and execution. The technological lessons learned during Montgomery's offensive had immediate applications in other theaters. American forces preparing for operations in Tunisia and later Sicily studied British techniques for coordinating artillery, armor, and air support in systematic offensive operations. Soviet observers present as liaison officers reported extensively on British methods for concentrating firepower and maintaining logistical support during extended operations. The systematic approach that Montgomery had developed for desert conditions proved adaptable to European terrain and weather, establishing doctrinal foundations that would guide Allied ground operations throughout the remainder of the war. Training programs instituted by Montgomery became standard throughout British Empire forces, with identical techniques being implemented in India, Australia, and Canada. The emphasis on combined arms coordination and realistic combat exercises proved so successful that these methods were adopted by American and other Allied forces as well. The transformation of British military effectiveness was permanent and measurable, with subsequent operations demonstrating consistently improved performance against German forces in all theaters. Montgomery's 90-day promise had catalyzed improvements that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Egypt. The strategic significance of Montgomery's victory extended beyond military considerations to encompass political and economic dimensions. British control of Egypt ensured continued access to Middle Eastern oil supplies that were essential for maintaining global military operations. The Suez Canal remained open to Allied shipping, preserving the shortest route between Britain and India, while denying German forces access to potentially decisive strategic resources. Most importantly, the victory demonstrated British capability for sustained offensive operations that convinced American leaders to commit fully to Mediterranean strategy, rather than focusing exclusively on direct assault against Germany through France. Churchill's public statements about Montgomery's achievement emphasized themes of British resilience and ultimate victory that had powerful propaganda value both domestically and internationally. The Prime Minister's famous declaration that, "This is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning," captured the psychological transformation that Montgomery's victory had created. For the first time since France fell, British leaders could point to clear evidence that German forces could be defeated decisively, and that ultimate Allied victory was achievable rather than merely hoped for. This confidence was infectious and measurable in subsequent military and civilian performance. Montgomery himself remained characteristically modest about his achievement, emphasizing the contributions of subordinate commanders and common soldiers, rather than claiming personal credit for tactical brilliance. His post-battle report stressed the importance of superior resources and preparation rather than individual leadership, although his role in creating the conditions for victory was obvious to all observers. This modest public posture enhanced his reputation and established the persona of competent professionalism that would define his public image throughout the remainder of his career. The combination of measurable achievement with unpretentious presentation proved ideal for wartime leadership requirements. The legacy of Montgomery's 90-day promise extends far beyond its immediate military significance to encompass fundamental lessons about leadership, planning, and resource utilization under extreme pressure. His willingness to commit publicly to a specific timeline created accountability that forced comprehensive preparation and prevented the incremental approach that had characterized previous British operations. By promising Churchill something that seemed impossible, he had created conditions that made the impossible necessary and therefore achievable. This combination of bold commitment with systematic preparation became a model for subsequent Allied operations throughout the war. The human cost of Montgomery's victory, while significantly lower than previous British operations, still represented thousands of individual tragedies for families throughout Britain and the Empire. Over 13,000 British casualties, killed and wounded, had paid the price for strategic success that transformed the course of the war. Montgomery's private correspondence reveals deep awareness of this human cost and determination to ensure that their sacrifice contributed to ultimate victory rather than merely temporary tactical success. The responsibility of command in modern warfare, with its massive scale and technological destructiveness, had profound psychological effects on leaders who bore direct responsibility for life and death decisions affecting thousands of individuals. The intelligence revolution that enabled Montgomery's victory established precedents for information warfare that influenced military thinking for decades after the war ended. The integration of ultra-intercepts with tactical planning demonstrated the decisive advantage that superior intelligence could provide when properly exploited through systematic operational planning. This lesson influenced post-war military doctrine and established intelligence capabilities as fundamental requirements for successful modern military operations. The combination of technological intelligence gathering with traditional reconnaissance and analysis became standard procedure for all subsequent major military operations. Equipment innovations developed for Montgomery's offensive, particularly in artillery fire control and tank gunnery, had immediate applications in other theaters and lasting influence on military technology. The systematic concentration of firepower that proved so effective against German defensive positions became doctrine for subsequent Allied operations throughout Europe. Tank tactics emphasizing coordinated squadron operations rather than individual combat proved superior to previous methods and established foundations for armored warfare that persisted throughout the Cold War period. Training methods instituted by Montgomery, emphasizing realistic combat exercises and combined arms coordination, became standard throughout NATO forces and influenced military education globally. The systematic preparation that made his 90-day promise achievable demonstrated the importance of comprehensive training over improvisation or tactical brilliance. This lesson influenced military thinking for generations, establishing systematic preparation as the foundation for successful operations rather than relying on battlefield improvisation or individual leadership capabilities. The transformation of British military effectiveness that resulted from Montgomery's victory had permanent consequences for Britain's strategic position throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. Confidence gained through measurable success against elite German forces enabled more ambitious operations and closer cooperation with American allies who had previously questioned British military capabilities. The psychological transformation was as important as tactical improvements in determining Britain's continued influence in Allied strategic planning and post-war international relations. Montgomery's achievement in fulfilling his impossible promise to Churchill represented more than military victory. It demonstrated fundamental principles about leadership, preparation, and resource utilization that transcend military applications. His systematic approach to seemingly impossible challenges, combining realistic assessment with bold commitments, established methods that prove applicable to complex problems in any field requiring coordinated effort and systematic resource application. The 90-day promise became a case study in effective leadership under extreme pressure and uncertainty. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about generals who kept impossible promises, soldiers who transformed defeat into victory, leaders who changed history through preparation and determination. Real people, real courage. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, India. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for ensuring that Bernard Montgomery's impossible promise doesn't disappear into silence. These leaders deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible.